As I mentioned at the beginning of Mass, every year, the first Sunday of Lent, in this 3-year cycle, we get one of the 3 versions of Christ's temptation in the desert on this first Sunday of Lent. Matthew, Mark, and Luke. And today, as in Matthew, today's version from Luke, we have the 3 temptations clearly set out. Now, in all the versions, it says that Jesus returned from the Jordan. This was right after his baptism. And one spiritual writer went so far as to say, well, this going into the desert, led by the Spirit, pushed by the Spirit, was like his confirmation, a test of his spiritual maturity. They went from the baptism to confirmation. And you could say that, not without stretching it too much, that Jesus' baptism was the revelation, the proclamation at least, of his divinity. You are my beloved Son, in whom I am well pleased. So you listen to him. Well, you could say that perhaps in the desert, it was his humanity that comes to the fore. If he delved more deeply into his divinity, his awareness of his divinity there in the baptism to the proclamation of the Father, here he's delving into the mystery of his humanity and all the temptations and challenges of our human nature, his human nature. And maybe you could bring them together by saying, in both cases, Jesus became more aware of what his being the Messiah actually meant, his being Son of God, his being the Christ, what it involved and what it didn't involve. So the revelation, that proclamation from the Father in some versions, is clearly a reference to this Isaiah 42, the suffering servant, that his being Son of God meant that not glory, but suffering and service. And similarly, service, you might say, is the theme also of the temptations in the desert. So let's look at them briefly. So Jesus was hungry after spending that time in the desert. Oh, and by the way, he was in the desert, so just as this is a reminder of what our own baptism and confirmation should lead us to, the struggles and the results that we should have, it's a reminder that we need to go into the desert as well in order to experience more deeply both our being children of God, experience that reality, that deepest reality of who we are, which we usually don't think of. If someone asks you, who are you? You'll probably say, well, I'm an accountant or something. But no, you should say, I'm a child of God, or I'm a being created in the image of God. But we don't say that because we're not aware of that most of the time in our daily life, unfortunately. So going into the desert is a way of clearing everything else out of the way of our daily activity and out of the way of our psyche to experience who we really are and the challenges that brings with it, as what happened with Jesus. So it may not be necessary theoretically. We should be able, as I say, to be aware of this in all our daily life. Most of us, most of the time, need to take time away from the easy securities and facile logic of what we think our human life is all about and what we think we really are, who we are, and get away from the cultural conditioning and even the religious conditioning and all the societal, political conditioning that we say, oh, who you are. Well, get beyond all that to experience your being created in God's image and to experience what the challenges then are of your humanity are in the perspective of that deepest dignity and calling as a child of God. So that's what Jesus was doing, and it's for us to undergo as well. So if you are the Son of God, turn this stone into some bread. Use your talents for your own pleasure, for your own enjoyment, which is a temptation of our humanity, to make our life about pleasure and gratification of our own ego self. And Jesus says, no, we have to go higher. We don't live on bread alone, but on the higher. We're nourished and given pleasure and joy by higher things, which put everything else into context. So nowhere in the gospel, including here in the desert, do you see Jesus use his powers for his own pleasure or gain. Nowhere. Nor should we. Now secondly, in Luke's version, you have the temptation of seeing all the kingdoms of the world in a single instant, coming second. In Matthew's version, it's last, because there's a certain dramatic climax to bring the worshiping the devil as the final temptation. But there's also a logic to its being second here, as we'll see in a second. So the temptation is power and fame, not just money and pleasure, but power and fame and success in worldly terms. All this glory of the world can be yours. But what does Jesus say elsewhere in the gospel? What does it profit a person if he gains the whole world and loses himself or herself in the process? Her real self is a child of God. So, how do we measure success? In God's eyes, I guarantee that your success as a human being and as a child of God is not measured by how high you go in the academic or political or social scale, or how much power you gain, or how much fame you have. I guarantee, in the final count, that's not going to matter for anything, except did you use it, if you had it, for the kingdom of God. But it's rather going to be, how did you use whatever power you were given, whatever influence you had, whatever position you had, for the kingdom of God, and not for yourself. So, Jesus fled from any indication or any temptation of being made king in this world, because that wasn't what he was about. That's not what we're about either. So if we seek to be president, for example, it's not for our ideas and our aggrandizement, but how do we really serve the common good and the kingdom of God? Really serve it, not according to some ideology. So there actually says in the gospel that after you did the miracle of the multiplication of the loaves, it says the people wanted to take him away and make him king in an earthly sense, and he fled into the mountains to escape, because that was the temptation. It's not who he was about. He didn't want earthly power or power for himself. Nor should we. If we do get earthly power or fame, it should almost be imposed on us by circumstances and used with great trepidation for the betterment of the human community and the kingdom of God. And finally, in a sense almost most insidiously, as I say in this version, it's clearer, because this is the final temptation, is put on the pinnacle of the temple. So now it's not just the whole power of the world, but religious power. We're standing on the pinnacle of the temple. How many people throughout history have sought to stand on the pinnacle of the temple with religious power? And the temptation was, well, use it for your own aggrandizement as well. And that's the most insidious temptation. And it can take the form in our own lives of, I'm holy, I'm practicing my faith, I belong to the right church and the right religion and the right community, and I'm going to judge everybody else in terms of that. It's for my own ego aggrandizement that I'm a Catholic, or a Muslim, or whatever. And that's a temptation for everybody. You don't have to look very far in our world and in our history to see that has been a big temptation for lots of people, and still is. For us, you better watch out. Throw yourself down, show your power. Never did Jesus use his religious power for anything other than service and for self-effacement, for the giving of himself to others, for healing. And he was always pointing to the Father, not to himself. So these are temptations not just for Jesus, human temptations which come up, but temptations for us as well. Who are we really? And how do we use any of the gifts that we've been given on any of these levels? Is it for our ego, or is it for service? We're called to be suffering servants as well. Suffering in the sense of taking on the suffering of humanity, to which we're all connected, we're all joined, and offering our energies, our position, our power, our money, who we are, as Jesus did, and with Jesus, and through his Spirit, for the betterment of the common good and for the spread of the kingdom of God.